So last week, we did a RPG horror story where the true culprit was not a that guy. The true culprit was instead imposter syndrome. Now, imposter syndrome is something that a lot of people struggle with, and I've noticed that a lot of people especially struggle with it in Dungeons and Dragons, and that really sucks. D&D is a game that we are playing to have fun, and it can be really hard to have fun if you have imposter syndrome. When you feel that sort of weight on your mind when you're playing a game, it can kind of ruin the experience, especially in a game that requires such engagement with the story and with your fellow party. I think imposter syndrome is an issue that we don't talk about enough. So today, we are finally going to be tackling imposter syndrome and how to overcome it within your D&D games. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, let's start out by asking ourselves, what exactly is imposter syndrome? Well, unfortunately, I don't think I'm really qualified to be talking about this. Hell, I don't even know if I'm qualified to be talking about D&D in the first place. I'm pretty lucky to have this platform, and there are much better people who know way more about this topic and this game in general. They know way more about it, and they are much more worthy to be talking about this, especially when compared to me. So, shit. So yeah, I'm sure a lot of you can already see how imposter syndrome can manifest itself in a Dungeons & Dragons game. DMs who feel like they're entrapping their players in a bad game, when in truth, the DM just made a simple mistake, and their game, in actuality, is really good. Players who feel like they're turning into problem players, when, again, they just made a simple mistake. You're not becoming a horrible player because of one bad thing. Or, they're not making mistakes at all. There is no problems, and we, as D&D players or Dungeon Masters, are just overthinking things and suffering from imposter syndrome. So, how do we overcome this? Well, let's start out with tip number 1. So I already briefly mentioned don't overthink things, and yeah, that is a major part of this. Especially as a Dungeon Master, I often overthink minor mistakes that I make in my games. One character that wasn't done very well. One exposition dump that was a little bit sloppy. I overthink that and then morph into this idea that my game sucks, and that my campaign is horrible, and that my players feel entrapped by it, blah 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 blah. That is not true at all, but that's where my spiraling thoughts can take me at times when I focus too much on minor mistakes in my game. Overthinking small things is a big part of why we develop imposter syndrome in our games. This doesn't just apply to Dungeon Masters. In that story that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we had a player who was overthinking every single action that they took in the game as spotlight hogging. Every time they took the spotlight for even a couple seconds, they felt like they were stealing it from other players, even though that's not true at all. You're part of this game. You're supposed to participate. You're not spotlight hogging just because you came up with an idea one time and presented it to the players. This happens all the time. We overthink these minor little inconveniences, and they spiral into much bigger deals in our minds. And it is really important to recognize small mistakes as just that. Small mistakes. We all make mistakes, and recognizing those mistakes, that is really important. Being self-critical is good, but don't be overly self-critical. Don't beat yourself up because you made a couple of errors. We're all human. We're not going to be perfect at this game. No one is perfect at this game. It's part of being human. And so when you make mistakes, recognize them as things that need to be solved, but not things that you need to think about all the time. There are a lot of mistakes that you can make in D&D. This is a game that has giant textbooks in it. You're going to make errors, especially when you're the Dungeon Master. You're running this entire world for your players. There's going to be parts of it that are rough, and that is okay. Recognize the mistakes that you make, attempt to fix them, but after that, move on and continue running a great game. You're not a bad DM or a bad player. You're not a bad DM or a problem player because of minor errors. Recognizing those minor errors are good, but overthinking them, that is what can lead to imposter syndrome. Alright, we just talked about not overthinking our own mistakes, but we're not just overthinking our own mistakes, are we? We tend to also overthink the opinions of our fellow players, and often we assume those opinions to be negative. Now this, in my experience, is really harmful. One time I had a series of scheduling conflicts that lasted like 2 weeks, and It sucked. For those 2 weeks, we couldn't play games, but it was only 2 weeks. In hindsight, the thoughts I was having were ridiculous. I thought that the players were canceling over and over and over again because they hated my game, because I did something horrible, that they hated me, and that we weren't going to be friends anymore, blah, 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 blah. It was spiraling thoughts that went way, way, way too far. This is very similar to the first point, but in my opinion, this is way, way worse, because there is an easy solution to this, or at least, well, depending on who you are, it's an easy solution. You need to talk to your fellow players. We keep on guessing at the thoughts of other players and assuming that those thoughts are negative, but we never confirm that, and in all likelihood, that isn't true. Fellow players probably are just making as many mistakes as you are, and fellow players are probably not really thinking about your mistakes. They're probably thinking about their own. Talking it out, talking to each other, creating a support system in our own D&D groups, that's important. Creating a system where we're all lifting each other up, where we're all having fun in this game, that is important to having a great D&D game. Being open about the things that you think you're doing wrong in this game. If you feel like you're spotlight hogging, taking away the spotlight from other players, ask them. Ask your fellow players, like, hey guys, do you feel like I'm taking the spotlight too much? Don't guess that they think you have main character syndrome. Just ask. That is a major part of D&D. Now, of course, I know what you guys are thinking. What if my fellow players lie? I'm gonna be honest, I had that thought too. Every time I ask my players, did you guys have fun? And they say, yes, we had a great time. I would at times assume that they were just lying to me, and that was stupid. They're not lying. They have no reason to lie. If your fellow players are telling you that they're having fun in your game, if your fellow players are telling you that you're a great party member, they're not lying. They're telling you the truth. This is especially true if you include some self-criticism in there. People are way more comfortable giving criticism if you criticize yourself. I sometimes will say things like, hey guys, I felt like the combat encounter this session was kind of rocky. What are your thoughts on that? If they say, yes, we felt the same thing, then great, I know to improve the combat encounter. But if they say, no, I thought the combat encounter was great, then I know that they're telling the truth. People are really comfortable giving critique if you criticize yourself. And if they counteract your self-criticism, then that is probably their genuine, real thoughts. Look, your fellow players are not conspiring against you to hide the fact that they feel entrapped by your game and actually secretly hate you. If you ask for criticism and they say that they're having a great time, then that is the truth of it. Don't overthink what your fellow players are thinking, and don't assume that their thoughts are negative, because that's not always going to be true. Most importantly, you need to accept their positive thoughts, and that brings us neatly on to our third point. So often, I see the advice, not just in D&D, but just in life in general, that we need to exclusively focus on our mistakes. We don't need to think about good things, because good things don't need to be changed. Don't even bother thinking about good things. Don't reward yourself. Don't congratulate yourself. Just focus on the bad, because that's what needs to change. Now, of course, like I've said before, self-critique is good. Looking at the mistakes that you're making and fixing them, that's good. But I think ignoring your successes is ridiculous. You're not a narcissist because you acknowledge that you did a good thing, and that especially applies in D&D. As a dungeon master, I used to do this a lot. I would just look at the things I'm doing well as, okay, yeah, that's good. Don't need to think about that anymore. Let's focus on the bad. And that was horrible for my mental state as a dungeon master. I should, congratulate myself, pat myself on the back at least a little bit for the sessions that went well. If you spent weeks working on the idea of a one-shot, spent hours going through every monster stat block, curating great maps, and working through an amazing story with your players, and it turned out great, your players had a lot of fun, a lot of DMs will sit back and think, yeah, that's what I was supposed to do. No! Fuck that! You did great! You worked on this for weeks! You're allowed to feel at least a little bit of satisfaction because of your success. Humility is good, but acknowledging your successes, that is great. Just being able to look at a session and feel like, hey, I did a good job here, that is a great part of being a dungeon master, being a player too. If you just had a great backstory reveal or a really good roleplay moment, you're allowed to feel good about that. You don't need to brush those thoughts of success aside to just focus on the things you did wrong. If you are succeeding at having a good time in this game, you're doing everything you need to as a player and as a dungeon master, and that is great. Alright, next tip. This is a really big one. When we're trying to get those successes, it's important that we improve as DMs and as players. We are all constantly trying to make our games better and make ourselves better at playing them. But one major thing that can inevitably lead into imposter syndrome is setting unrealistic expectations for ourselves. We, on RPG Horror Stories, often talk about people setting unrealistic expectations for other people. However, what I think is far more common is DMs and players setting self-imposed expectations that inevitably slide into imposter syndrome when you don't fulfill things that are unrealistic for yourself. Now, I don't think the goals in themselves are the part that's unrealistic. It's the time frame that so often is unrealistic. Like, for example, if you want to be a better strategist in combat, create more in-depth builds, that's great, but that's going to take time for you to master. Your first custom build isn't going to be perfect. If you want to homebrew an amazing monster, your first one is probably not going to knock it out of the park. Those skills take time. It takes time to improve that. It takes a long time to be good at something. And on top of that, when you start, you're not going to be good. You're probably going to be bad, and that is okay. However, so often, we frame that beginning part, that rough patch, as cringe or bad or gross and something that we need to hide, and that's lame, guys. When you start a new skill, when you start trying something new, you are going to be bad at first. It is going to happen, and we're all new to something at some point. We were all new to D&D at some point in our lives. And when we started, we probably weren't as good as we are now. That's just how growth works. It's okay not to be good at something. It's okay to take time to improve. That's something that we need to learn. We need to learn that we can't be good in a month. Accepting that time, accepting those rough patches, that is part of avoiding imposter syndrome in your own games. Now, arguably, this is the most important point, and it applies to imposter syndrome as a whole. Just like how improving in D&D takes time, improving your own mental state when it comes to imposter syndrome, that's going to take time too. A big part of why people feel trapped in this is that they expect that their imposter syndrome is going to just fade away in a day, that watching one video like this one right here is going to just get rid of all of the problems in a few minutes, but guys, that's not going to happen. And it leads people into imposter syndrome in the first place. It becomes like this vicious cycle where you expect it to go away, but it doesn't, and it just leads you further and further down into the spiral. And that really sucks. Look, I wish these problems could be fixed in a day. I wish that all of this could go away. I wish that imposter syndrome was not part of my DM life and that I could just snap my fingers and it was gone in a heartbeat. But that's not the case. All these tips I'm talking about right now, they're not going to become an intrinsic part of your D&D playstyle. They're not going to become an intrinsic part of your mind just because you watch this video. It's going to take a long time. It's going to take a lot of learning in order for this to happen. It's going to take a lot of growth. That's just like I said in the beginning of the video, that's part of being human, and that is okay. I don't know if this advice is good. I know that I'm the pseudo-therapist of D&D, as some people in the comments have dubbed me, but I'm not an actual therapist. I don't really know what I'm talking about. A lot of this is stuff that I Googled, and I'm just trying my best here. I want people to have fun playing this game. It breaks my heart when people don't have fun playing this game because I love TTRPGs. I mean, some of my fondest memories that I've had in the past few years are memories I've shared with my D&D group. And when I hear that people are getting bad memories from D&D, it sucks. It really, really sucks. So I'm trying my best to prevent that. And did I do a good job? I have no idea. You guys can let me know in the comments, but I'm trying my best here, and I hope this helps somebody out there, somewhere in the universe. If you guys enjoyed this video, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out our RPG Horror Story series, where we talk about the best of the worst of Dungeons & Dragons. And while you're there in the card, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own tips or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment. It's gonna be okay. To let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Farewell.